my friends. I am Vivian McPeak, and this is Hemp Present. If you have feedback or would like to suggest a guest or topic for Hemp Present, email me at hempresent@gmail.com. It's always great to hear from you. Brett McFarland grows food, builds shelters, and makes music in Humboldt County, California. In 2014, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for growing weed and refusing to implicate others. He did his time, and he's now working to free the plant and those still serving time for cannabis. He released some new music on 420, and he is here today to give us the 411 on the 420. Welcome, Brett, to Cannabis Radio.
Hey, thank you so much, Vivian. It's such an honor to be here.
Hey, it's my pleasure, man. You have a new album, Humboldt, that was released on April 20th of this year. I want to discuss your music and play a little bit of it. But before we do that, let's just kind of touch on some of your history. Your father was a military man, I read, and you moved around quite a bit. You eventually settled in Humboldt, California, an area that's been referred to as the Bud Basket of America for its rich history of cannabis culture. Can you kind of talk about your arrival in Humboldt and what kind of impact it had on you? How did you end up there?
Wow, it was such a kind of spontaneous and a surprising unfolding of events. But I was farming in South Dakota at the time, and I had this friend who called me up out of the blue, and he goes, "Brett, move to California with me. Let's go, man. I know you're the only one. You're the only one who's adventurous enough to do it." And I was in the middle of my farming vegetables, 3 acres of vegetables, and man, I told him, no, I can't do it. But we had a frost kill our crop that year early, and I just said, you know what, maybe I will go. So I went on a road trip out I flew into Reno, went on a road trip to Humboldt and to California and Southern Oregon. And I landed in Humboldt, and I saw they were on the exchange program with my university, so I could go there, pay the same tuition. Mostly I was just trying to let my parents off easy before I told them I was dropping out of school to be a vegetable farmer. And, I came here at 20, I came to Humboldt at 20 years old. I didn't know a person in the state of California. My friend who asked me to move didn't come with. So I just came here by myself, and I ended up in Humboldt. I ended up going to HSU and living in Arcata. And that's when I started to see what was going on. I had a little vegetable stand in Arcata, and people would show up to my vegetable stand and they would pull out these big old wads of cash. And I'm like, what do you guys do? I was intrigued, and they told me, oh, we're farmers just like you. And I'm like, that's funny, because our wallets did not look the same. But that was my introduction here. Was just, I came out on a road trip, and I've been here ever since, and I absolutely love it. I love the community. I love the culture. I love the weather, the geography, all of it.
You mentioned that you kind of referred to, you started a 3-acre organic fruit and vegetable farm. And as you just said, you sold your produce at the Arcata Families Market. I live in Seattle today, but I'm a 5th-generation Californian, and that's just such a beautiful area. But can I ask, where did you get your farming experience from?
Well, I grew up, my dad was in the military, but I spent my summers going back to my grandparents' farm in Minnesota. So I can remember being on a hay wagon when I was 9 years old and could barely wrestle one of them big bales. But I started working with my grandparents. And then for high school, we actually moved to South Dakota, which was where my dad was from, even though we hadn't been there the whole time because the military was sending us all over. But they sent us there all of a sudden. And I spent my formative high school years there in South Dakota working in an agrarian community, working for farmers, having a big garden. And then when I was 19, I had this entrepreneurial spirit of man, let's try to, I had some shitty bosses in my life, already by then. And I'm like, man, I want to work for myself. And I thought if I could grow vegetables, maybe I could provide them to the community, and that's how I could, make a living. And so I did my first farm at 19 years old, which was 3 acres. And then at 20, I moved to California and did another 3-acre farm.
Wow. You kind of talked about the fact it didn't take you long to witness the Humboldt cannabis economy. You probably did the math that producing weed was going to be more financially lucrative than growing fruit and vegetables. And you eventually started growing cannabis. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. When I first started, everything was what they called 215. It was being
Yep.
done as medical under Prop 215, and so I was told, hey, if you go to see this medical doctor and you tell him that cannabis is therapeutic for you and it helps you in your life, like it can help you calm your anxiety and it helps you sleep and it's of a medicinal benefit to you, then they'll write you a doctor's recommendation, which is, commonly called a 215 in those days. And with your 215, you're allowed to grow, X amount of plants. In Mendocino at that time, I want to say it was a plant number. I don't know what it was, if it was a dozen plants or, but in Humboldt, it was square footage. You could have as many plants in 100 square feet or whatever it was. I think that's what it was. It was 100 square feet. And with your one, and then of course, if you had any, other people that you helped, you could grow exclusively for them as well, and so that was what the cannabis culture, and it was still very, in a way, it was still it was on the down low. It was on the down
underground,
low.
right?
Yeah, it was in this weird quasi place where like the doctor, for example, the way I found the doctor was somebody had put a note, they had just wrote a note and put it on the fridge. It was all, word of mouth kind of stuff. A few years later, everything, pretty much from the time I moved here up until even now, it just increasingly became more and more mainstream, more and more public. It used to be, the grocery stores, were a little more on the outskirts, and even them, it was like pretty soon they're everywhere, and the grocery stores proliferated, and people became more and more candid about it. In fact, when I first moved here, you did not ask people in the rural county what they did. That was taboo. You didn't ask them what they did. You never said like, hey, what do you do for work? No, don't ask that question.
Right. Everybody got it. Right. There was a whole economy. It was a whole economy, and like they were selling cars, refrigerators, generators, and everybody knew where the money was coming from. Right. It was just not spoken about.
Yes, and there was a risk to speaking about it because even under medical at that time, you were having these situations where in the southern part of the state, in Sacramento and in LA, where there'd be this proliferation of medical dispensaries. And then the feds would come in. This happened under Bush. It happened under Obama, even during the first part of Obama's tenure. The feds went in, and they closed all of these very legitimate medical. They just kind of got all, like, they didn't care who you were and what you were doing, how by the books you were. They were closing all the medical dispensaries. Of course, they would pop back up again later somewhere else. But because of that reality, because there was still the very real, potential that the feds would come in and shut down even the state, licensed medical places. People were just more cautious. You didn't speak about it. And so if someone said, to say what'd you do, it's like you're trying to get them to say something that really doesn't need to be said.
Right. And of course, there's just been tremendous change since then, right? It's a whole different environment in some ways. We got about a minute till the first break. Just quickly, what's it like there today?
Okay, well, right now I am up in the mountains, right outside Willow Creek. I'm actually on the sovereign nation of Hoopa, the Hoopa tribe here. We're doing a project for them, and anyway, so I'm up in the Trinities, overlooking the river, and it's probably about 95, and it's cooking, and
Rub it in,
hot.
man. Rub it in.
Yeah. What's it like where you're at?
Oh, it's like 60 degrees, maybe, or maybe 55 degrees. I'm not sure what it is, but it's kind of overcast today.
Yeah, and it might be that way on the coast of Humboldt. I don't know, but I'm inland right now, so.
Right. Well, that sounds awesome. Like, I'm a fifth generation Californian, even though I'm transplanted, and I crave the hot weather. We're going to go quickly to a break and come back with our second segment with Brett McFarland, and we're going to talk about how the tables kind of turned on you and actually listen to some of your music. So don't go anywhere.
Time to roll out for the people that let us hemp present. Hang loose. We're coming right back.
We are back with Brett McFarland. Brett, in 2013, you were convicted of conspiracy to distribute 100 kilos of cannabis. Despite there being no evidence, no plants, no money, the case solely relying on the testimony of informants. And that's a story that we've heard many, many times during the war on cannabis. That, first of all, what came down, and that must have been very hard on you and your family.
Well, it was very scary. It was very, very frightening. I had never been in any kind of trouble, like this kind of magnitude of trouble with the law before. My family, was, no one that's not like in my family. There's not, my parents and aunts and uncles were, they were farmers, and then they were, my dad was in the military, my mom was a nurse. So, it was there was some shame involved with it for some of my family. Like, it was kind of it was like, it was very hard, and it was hard to witness that, pain in them. And it was very frightening because there was a lot of threats going around, and there was, basically during the course of the investigation, there was a lot of people got phone calls, and a lot of people were threatened with lengthy sentences if they didn't, sort of bend to the will of the agents. And so it was very frightening, and it also felt it was maddening. I was so, as it started to play out, I was so angry that, like, this is how it went down, that it, like, I'd seen enough movies that I guess I had this sense that, justice would require a phone tap, or would require, some kind of, controlled bus, or like a wire tap, or
Some
something.
kind of evidence, right?
Yeah, some kind of physical evidence, because basically what they have is, and the state is not allowed to do this. They don't have this power. The state could have not done my case. They wouldn't have, because in the federal case, hearsay with conspiracy law is it's the only evidence required for a conviction. You don't require anything else. And the danger of that is that all it requires is somebody saying you did something for them. And, ideally they try to get, two people that corroborate. It doesn't even have to be the same thing, just like a theme. Like, the theme could be like, oh yeah, this person, grew cannabis, or they, I saw plants in their yard or something. And that's actually literally, I listened to I got to read, they give you discovery, and I got to read the testimonies. And the first person that was their main informant, he named about 30 people in California, I think 33 in California and elsewhere. And anyway, what he said about me was that he said I had sold him 2 to 4 pounds of weed on 2 occasions, 2 years prior to, like, this, to him getting arrested for cannabis. So he had a cannabis arrest. He was pulled over with cannabis. He never claimed it was mine. He said, no, 2 years ago, on 2 occasions, I bought 2 to 4 pounds from him. So that was what they had.
And he might have been getting a deal for that, right? He might have been getting.
He did. He did get a deal for that. Oh yeah, he definitely got a deal for that. And then later they had an informant that said, oh yeah, I visited Brett, back in 2006. So like 6 years ago is basically what they're saying. I visited him 6 years ago, and I saw 20 plants in his yard. And I listened to the interview, and in the interview, the agent said, well, and how big would you think those 20 plants are? What do you think? Maybe about 5 pounds a piece? And I heard the informant goes, I guess. And so that they wrote 20 times 5, and then that was how they came up with their number. They go, oh, there's 100 pounds right there. And the number for how big those plants were came directly out of the agent's mouth. They just made it up. They fed it right to their informant. When I heard it, I was outraged. I go, is that even legal? Are they allowed to do that? And I don't know. Anyway, I don't know what the law requires, but I do know that hearsay is admissible, and that what you do get a lot. They even admitted, in fact, even in my own sentencing hearing, the agent admitted, because when my lawyer cross-examined and said, hey, did these informants get deals? And he said, yes, they did. And he goes, how do you feel about that testimony? Do you think that it's always correct? And the agent on the stand says, no, oftentimes they tell us, things that are not correct. So even by the agent's own words, this information is, sometimes has its, faultiness, which it did. But
and you were given 5 years.
Yes, I was the last person to sign in the case, and at one point I got a call from my attorney and said, "Hey, they did a superseding indictment for you, and now you have a 10-year mandatory minimum." And I said, "Bill, what is this?" I go, This is them trying to get? Just want me to sign today?" He goes, "I think so." And he called him. He called him up and said, "Hey, if he signs for the 5, will you drop this new?" Because
So
a year into my whole case,
they plea bargained you, which they do always in federal cases, right?
yeah.
They threaten to completely destroy your life, right? And that's the majority of cases end up that way. You wrote a song about this, and I want to play a little bit of it, and then we'll talk about it. So
Okay.
so I Grew Weed by Brett McFarland.
I grew weed for Willie Nelson. I grew weed for Snoop Dogg. I grew weed for the love of freedom. I grew weed for God. And I grew weed for New York City. I grew weed for LA. I grew weed for the great state of Texas. I grew weed for the USA. And I grew weed for little Billy Clinton, though he did not inhale. I grew a whole bunch for heaven and a little bit for hell. I grew weed, I grew weed, big old buds from little bitty seeds. I grew weed, I grew weed, big old buds from little bitty seeds. I grew weed. I grew weed for the FBI. I grew weed for the DEA. I grew weed for the lawyers to make it legal someday. And I grew weed for the prisons who locked me away. I grew weed for the snitches just to give them bitches something to say. And I grew weed for Wiz Khalifa. Well, I was on the inside. Folks say, how could you do that? Well, I did it with my mind. I grew weed, I grew weed, big old buds from little bitty seeds. I grew weed, I grew weed, big old buds from little bitty seeds. I grew weed. I grew weed for my neighbors. I grew weed for my friends. I grew weed for Martha Stewart, Joe and Seth Rogen. And I grew weed for Beyonce, Rihanna, Jay-Z and crew. I grew weed for your mama and your daddy too. I grew weed for the sick, grew it for the poor. I grew a little for my own head, and then I grew some more. I grew weed, I grew weed, big old buds from little bitty seeds. I grew weed, I grew weed, big old buds from little bitty seeds. I grew weed. I grow a lot on the farm today, but I don't grow weed no more. Now that it's legal, I just buy it from the store. I grew weed, I grew weed, big old buds from little bitty seeds. I grew weed, I grew weed, big old buds from little bitty seeds. I grew weed.
Brett, that is a great song, man. And the tune and the video have top-notch production values. You were writing songs, I think, and playing them for your fellow inmates while incarcerated. I believe you could hold your own with any country artist out there. I mean, you are great. Where did you get your chops and musical influences from?
Well, my dad played music. So we had a guitar around growing up, and my brother really got into it. And I didn't pick up the guitar till, a little bit later. I picked up the guitar around 18. My brother was into it real early. But yeah, I just kind of just play for my friends, and I play around the campfire. And this whole thing with incarceration, it really set it off in me, because it was something I needed. It was my medicine. It was my outlet to be able to put what happened into song. And even in that case of the song "I Grew Weed," it's sort of there's a playful spirit that exists in that music, but it also it's a way of transmuting the pain and suffering, because it's born from a place. Some of these songs are born from a place of real hurt, of real
and it's
trauma.
Great that you have that you're actually do some narration in at the end there, and you really drive home the seriousness of it after this kind of playful song. I Grew Weed has been out for less than a month already, and it has 118,000 views on YouTube. What has the response been like for you?
It's surprising, of course, encouraging. Because I barely created a social media account in the fall time. I basically, when I got home from prison, I kind of went and hid. I had some healing to do. I didn't even know that. But I went and I worked hard. I was trying to just put my life back together and create some order and stability. And I kind of turned my back on music for years. And I was able to basically heal a part of myself that was broken and wounded from incarceration. And as soon as I did, I started to play music. And that was literally probably about a year ago that I started to actually decide I'm going to bring this music practice back into my life. Wow. And as soon as I brought it back in, things started happening. I made a social media account, Instagram account. And within my third post, I was contacted by one of my heroes, Earl Thomas Bridgman. He's a legendary blues musician. And he told me some things that really touched me. And that kind of just lit my fire. In fact, he even asked me to play some shows with him. So nice. I did. And then I pulled together a band, over the winter. And then I got, all of a sudden I got this flood of people reaching out to me over this winter time. And I was yeah. And so it's been amazing to see it grow is the short answer. It's been absolutely amazing.
Awesome. We're going to go to another break and come back with our final segment for Brett McFarland.
Time to roll out for the people that let us hemp present. Hang loose. We're coming right back.
We're back for the final segment with Brett McFarland. Brett, so you have a whole album's worth of material?
Yeah, I I believe, about a month ago, I released the album Humboldt. And yeah, I'm so proud of that album. I'm so grateful to have been able to finish it. And it's out on all the platforms. It's on Spotify, YouTube, Pandora, everywhere music is streamed. You can find Humboldt, the album.
When you were released from prison, after spending, did you spend all 5 years?
No, I ended up doing just under 4.
4 years. You came out into a changed world where pot was being sold in stores, yet thousands of Americans are still incarcerated for cannabis. You've turned your experience of being victimized by prohibition into a powerful musical statement. Can you talk about your determination to speak out for those who are still serving time for weed?
Yeah, well, sometimes there's a little thing called survivor's guilt. It's like sometimes it feels, I feel for all those people that are still there. And there's years where you push it out of your mind, and then there's other times where it creeps back in where man, it's not right now. And yet you can see things are changing all around. And so it's like, man, there's a motivation to be part of that momentum, part of that change that's coming. Is like, man, I want to help be a part of easing some of that suffering.
Right. Did you write that song in jail or in prison?
Which one? Oh, which one is that? The I Grew Weed song? Yeah. No, that one I wrote since coming home. I would say, in fact, if you listen to the album Humboldt, there's a song called I Ain't That, which is I wrote before going to prison. And then probably about half of those songs were written in in prison, and the other half are actually, written more recently. Yeah, there was part of the message in that whole album. There's a message in there about unity. That's one of the big themes that comes up in my music. And so, yeah, I just feel really grateful to live in Humboldt County, to have the community support that I do. And I wanted to be a voice for this amazing community and kind of speak on some topics that are so much bigger than me, but that I feel close to and connected with, for being in Humboldt and being part of this community, being part of the farmers market. Like today, like I said, I'm working up at the Hoopa Valley Tribe, sovereign nation. And it's amazing for me to look around and see this place where you have rednecks and you have hippies and you have tribal members all working together at certain points to do things, like big things, like the undamming of the Klamath River, the largest dam removal and salmon restoration in world history. And it's happening right now. They literally just dynamited the dams this winter, like explosives. And now at least parts of them, and now they're taking them apart. And that was done through people working together across party lines, across cultural lines. And in fact, there's a song on my album called Klamath that talks about this whole thing. And I'm so inspired by this community.
If we could only get some of that cooperation and unity on the national level right now, man, because we're hurting, we could really use it. Our time's winding down. We have about a minute and a half. What final thoughts would you like to leave our listeners with?
Well, to underscore what you just said, that you feel is important in our country. That's the message in this whole album. And I feel so encouraged and inspired to see that diversity in my fans, to see that this music could appeal to someone who might identify as a redneck, or someone who might identify as a hippie, or, just across these party and cultural lines, to be able to make music that connects with people like that. It's nourishing my heart and is nourishing my soul and giving me hope for that very thing that you said is needed for this country, which is unity.
Well, yeah, I just want to say, man, the production values, it sounds like you've been doing music for 20 years professionally. The song is stellar, and just everything about it is just really excellent. And so, congratulations, man, on that. It's a great gift to all of us. And I really appreciate everything that you're doing, man. And I wish you nothing but the best luck in all of your endeavors.
Thank you.
You bet. Brett McFarland, found at brettmcfarlandmusic.com. Thanks for being on the show, man.
Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Absolutely. That concludes this installment of Hemp on Cannabis Radio. When it comes to prohibition, you've got the right not to remain silent. Activism requires a voice, so find your voice and speak up for justice, because resistance is fertile. The Hemp Present intro music is 7 Mile Beach by Joanne Rand, and the outro music is Take Back the Plant by Stickerbush. See you next time. Stay still.
Marijuana!